Good afternoon. I hope you have been attending the session today, which we've been holding all afternoon, sponsored by the AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program. Our symposium today is called Forward Together, where science, ethics, and religion intersect in a changing world. And we've had fabulous discussions this afternoon on everything from how scientists can engage more fruitfully with faith communities to topical parallel sessions on the environmental stewardship, public health, race and racial justice, evolution, artificial intelligence. What am I missing here? We've even discussed things like genetics and what it means to be human. So I hope you've enjoyed the parallel sessions. And now we are entering into our closing plenary, which I'm very excited about. The title of this session is called Shared Values, Building Trust and Connections Between Scientific and Faith Communities. I think I need to add a few reminders here. If you are just joining us, you may not realize that you can ask questions. Just put them in the Q&A function throughout the session. You can also upvote other people's questions. We also have ASL interpretation, as you see. And I believe we also have captioning that you can turn on. I would need to test that to make sure. I'd like to remind you that this session is being recorded and that we will be having short remarks by both of our speakers and then a conversation between our two speakers and myself, and also addressing some of the questions that you have. So with that, I'm hoping we can kick off this discussion. My name is Jennifer Wiseman. I am the director of the AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DoSER program. We have a fabulous DoSER staff that's been orchestrating and sometimes moderating the discussions today, and they're behind the scenes right now. And I'd also like to remind you, which I will again at the end of the session, that we will have a reception, an informal reception right after this session at 5 o'clock Eastern time, which you are certainly welcome to join. And you can join it the same way you join other sessions by clicking on the button there on the symposium homepage. So let's get right into this. What are these shared values and how do we build trust and connections between scientific and faith communities? While studies have shown that public trust in science as a whole is strong, there are questions that often arise about public confidence in specific scientific advances and how scientific evidence is created, understood, and applied. While science can inform public discourse on these issues at the forefront of science, values and identity also play a role in how people ultimately understand and respond. And as we know, many people, most people in our country and world identify with a faith tradition as part of their identity, part of their heritage, part of the way that shapes their values and how they frame their worldview and how they bring science and technology into that worldview and into that worldview of values. So in this plenary, Dr. Sudip Parikh and Reverend Dr. David Anderson are our honored guests, and they will discuss the importance of public trust in science and the role that faith communities can play in fostering engagement on science and society. So let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Sudip Parikh is really not a guest at all. He's the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He became this role, as well as the executive publisher of the Science family of journals, in January 2020, just before the pandemic set in. So he had a lot of challenges right before him. The son of Indian immigrants, Dr. Parikh completed undergraduate studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And early in his career, Dr. Parikh was a presidential management intern at the NIH and was awarded a National Science Foundation Graduate Student Research Fellowship while earning his PhD in macromolecular structure and chemistry from the Scripps Institute in La Jolla, California. He has spent 2 decades at this nexus of science, policy, and business, and an active member of the scientific advocacy community. So Dr. Parikh, we'd love to hear some of your opening comments, and then I will introduce Dr. David Anderson and we will continue the conversation. So welcome, Dr. Parikh.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everybody. I am so excited to be a part of this discussion with Dr. Anderson. We're talking about shared values and how shared values can build trust and connection between science and faith communities. And I thought I'd start with how I came to realize that shared values can build trust and community. I'm a scientist and I'm an American. And as Jennifer said, I'm the son of immigrants. And my uncle was an Indian geochemist working in France back in the 60s. And he joined NASA to work on the Apollo space program, and later became a professor at Appalachian State University in North Carolina. And he invited his family to join him in America, including my father. Now, my father was not a scientist. He got a technical degree in North Carolina, and then he worked in the textile mills of the rural western part of the state until his retirement. And my father is a person of tremendous faith. He happens to come from the Hindu faith tradition. Now, for those of you who don't know much about Hinduism, it's a polytheistic religion, but all the gods are reincarnations of the same God. Now, when he got to rural Hickory, North Carolina, first of all, he was probably the only person of Indian descent anywhere within 500 miles. But he found a place that he felt like was home, even though it was a town of 20,000 versus a city of millions. And he also recognized the devotion of the communities that he found there. And if anybody who knows anything about rural North Carolina knows that if you're a newcomer to that part of the state, you're going to be invited to church. And my father, coming from the Hindu tradition, felt a kinship with all of these faith traditions. And so he never turned an invitation down. And so I grew up having the opportunity to witness and be a part of the faith traditions in that community. We went to Baptist churches, we went to Lutheran churches, we went to Presbyterian churches, Methodist churches, AME Zion churches. We saw it all. It's funny how when you're a sort of a unicorn in a community, you get invited to all those faith traditions. And what I learned is that my father, through his willingness to engage, was able to build bridges with every one of these communities. He ended up starting a small business and really becoming an active member of the community in Hickory, North Carolina. Unexpected for an Indian immigrant in the 1960s and 70s. But that ability to engage, to build bridges, to form the bonds that come from breaking bread with each other, to form the bonds that come from shared values, the values of faith, of community, of caring about your children and their future, of caring about the environment around you, caring about fairness, caring about truth and honesty. That comes through when you spend time together. And so my father took us and our family through this together. But what it showed me was the value of showing up. It's the value of showing up. If you are different, if you are what might be part of a different community from another, that when you show up and you try and build those bridges, you actually can make progress. And that has, as I've grown up and as I've continued in my work and become a scientist, that has stayed with me. And so here at AAAS, where I have the privilege of being the Chief Executive Officer, we have programs that are about building bridges. We have programs that, like the dialogue on science, ethics, and religion, build bridges between scientists and other communities. Some of those are about science and journalists. Some of them are about science and politicians. And these are about science and the faith community, building bridges to seminaries, building bridges to faith communities. And it's about showing up, because it's not just about us here at the AAAS, the folks who work in this building that I happen to work in, but rather about building a tradition for scientists to engage in their communities, and to share their values, share their time, show up in the communities in which they live and work. And that's why I'm so excited about this conversation, because having a partner and engager like Dr. Anderson here on the virtual dais with me, I can't wait to have this conversation, because he shows up and we show up, and this is how we're going to build trust by sharing values and showing up for one another, so that in times of crisis like the pandemic, we are here for both parts of the soul, with vaccines for the protection from the virus, and faith for the nourishment of the soul. So I look forward to this conversation, and thank you again, Jennifer, for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parikh. We are honored to have you. We're going to have lots of questions for you, but thank you for sharing your personal story as well. That makes all the difference when we get to know each other's perspective. And so to join our conversation, we're very honored to have Dr. David Anderson. Reverend Dr. Anderson is the founder and president of the BridgeLeader Network and is one of the world's leading authorities on building bridges across deep divides of race, faith, culture, and wealth. His work has brought hope and healing to communities, families, and people in Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and North America, including work in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland during recent civil unrest around issues of race and police brutality. Known as the bridge building voice in the nation's capital, Dr. Anderson hosts this daily radio talk show called Real Talk with David Anderson on WAVA 105.1 FM here in DC, which is the most listened to Christian talk radio on East Coast and the second most listened to in the nation. He's also the founder and the senior pastor of Bridgeway Community Church. Dr. Anderson reaches a dynamic, multicultural congregation of over 10,000 weekly attendees in his church network. So we're so honored to have you. And I would like to say also that Dr. Anderson was instrumental in helping us kind of give a new vision for the DoSER program a decade ago when I was first getting started with it as well, and helped us kind of look to build a new dynamic in this dialogue and interaction between science and religion, and more importantly, between scientists and people of faith. And so, Dr. Anderson, we welcome you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us today.
Thank you, Jennifer. I tell you, you have been a friend. You have been someone who I've been able to walk with and learn from. And so knowing Dr. Jennifer Wiseman has been a joy to partner with. So I appreciate that. And Dr. Parikh, it's so good to be able to just dialogue with you and be friends with you and talk about these matters. So let me just thank DoSER and AAAS for the great work that you're doing to help build these bridges, which you had mentioned, Dr. Parikh. Building bridges is so very important, and it's kind of cool that you grew up in a family where they're trying to really model what it means to be a bridge builder. So maybe that's why we've got a kindred spirit, my brother. So I'm very grateful with regards to that. But when we talk about building bridges, what does that look like? Well, I have really believed that comprehension begins with conversation. And when you have conversation, sometimes you need interpretation. And so conversation is good, but if there is misinterpretation, it leads to conflict and misunderstanding. And so one, we must have conversation, but two, we must have interpretation. And as I think about interpretation, I think about the brain. And some of you are so much smarter than me when it comes to understanding the brain, but I've always been fascinated with the brain, studied it a bit, but I understand there are two hemispheres in the brain and there's a deep fissure between the two. But what I learned many years ago is that there is a connection somewhere in that fissure that allows the left and the right hemisphere to communicate one with the other. In other words, one side of the brain deals with what we say. The other side of the brain deals with what we portray. So if I say I'm happy, my face automatically smiles when I say the word happy. Why? Because those deep bridge nerve endings called the corpus callosum communicate between the two hemispheres. So what I verbalize and then what I show work together seamlessly because the deep bridge nerve endings called the corpus callosum are working well. When the deep bridge nerves don't work well, when the corpus callosum doesn't work well, you can say one thing like, I'm sad. But if the miscommunication and the misinterpretation takes place, I might smile at a funeral, even though I'm saying I'm sad. Or I might say I'm happy, but I have this mean look on my face. Well, to try to make that work verbally, if you were to right now say, I'm happy, but make a mean face, and you can try it if you want to, I'm happy, but make a mean face. It's hard to do it. You have to consciously think about it. Why? Because your corpus callosum is working fine. But if it wasn't working fine, then there would not be a connection between what you say verbally from one hemisphere and what you portray in your face with the other hemisphere, because your corpus callosum is working. In other words, the bridge is not out for many of you. But when it comes to the relationship between faith and science, when it comes to the relationship between sometimes faith, religion, or race and religion, there are a lot of different hemispheres. But when you see these deep fissures in our culture, we need people like you to be bridge builders. That's right. We need you to be like Dr. Parikh and his dad, to be interpreters. And what I have found in the work that I do is, man, between Black folk and white folk, they can see the same video, right? And come out with two completely different interpretations. Why is that? Because their perspectives are based within their hemisphere. And so they don't understand the other hemisphere. So what do? They demonize it. What we don't understand, we demonize, don't we? And so what we fear, we demonize. And so what we need are more bridge builders like Dr. Parikh, like Dr. Wiseman, like myself, and I'm sure many of you. And that's probably why you're a part of today's wonderful conference. More bridge builders who say, you know what, I'm going to step in and show up like the shared value that Dr. Parikh talked about. So I can be a bridge builder, which means I'm going to help with interpretation. So I'm going to say to my Black brothers and sisters, if we were talking about race, hey, listen, this may be what the thinking might be on that side. Let me help you kind of interpret what they're saying, even if they're not using the right words. Maybe they're saying, we just all need to be colorblind. Well, you know what? Let me help them understand that when they say that, I'll talk to my white brothers and sisters, when you say that, let me tell you what Black people are thinking, And so it's the same when it comes to faith and science. I had a guy in my church. He plays the guitar, a little short dude. His name was Ken. He could make the guitar scream, okay? One day, after several years, I said, I want to get to know that guy up there that's playing on the stage. And so I went to meet him, and his name is Ken. And I said, Ken, what do you do? He goes, oh, I'm a scientist. I said, really? Yeah, I'm a researcher at Hopkins, and I run this department. And I said, what department? And he started naming things I never even heard of before. Like he said, my training's in crystallography. I'm like, what the heck is that? And then he says, and I said, can I write this down? I literally wrote down his title. Here's his title: the director of the High Resolution Analytical Electron Microbeam Facility at Johns Hopkins University. What? I had to write it down because I'm never going to remember that. And so here is this guy playing the guitar on Sundays, and every day he's running this major department at Hopkins. And he says, do you want to come see my lab? I'm like, yeah, sure. So he takes me to his lab and he shows me what he does. And I'm thinking, my lab is the church. So you're here every single Sunday and you're doing rehearsals and all that. I've never been to yours. I want to come to yours. So to go show up at his place and to learn what he's doing was fascinating. And guess what? He said to me, Dr. Anderson, I want to be a bridge builder between science and faith. And I don't know how to bring those worlds together because I'm playing the guitar and I'm worshiping the Lord, but I'm a scientist at heart. And I said to him, there are a lot of people like you. I know Dr. Jennifer Wiseman and so many others, right? Who are like you that use, as Jennifer would say, use science to not turn religion away, but actually use science to inspire even greater worship. And so I am so happy to be with you today because I believe that if we can inspire more bridge builders who understand that comprehension begins with conversation and that conversation needs interpretation. And when you have adequate interpretation, you can actually lead to something really beautiful. But when the bridge is out, people demonize one another. So let's turn that around and keep building these bridges and go forward together.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like we could just stop with that, but we won't. So anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. Actually, this parallels back to our kind of opening conversation at the beginning of the afternoon, where we were talking about how building relationships and making contact between scientists and faith communities, and these are overlapping communities. As you said, there are scientists who themselves are involved in faith communities, is key to helping science flourish in this country and around the world. And so sometimes when you throw out the phrase science and religion, we automatically think about sort of philosophical issues, and are science and religion compatible? And there are many, or how so? And there's a whole history to this, and it's wonderful scholarship and good. But we try with the DoSER program to help build relationships and bring scientists and people of faith together to talk about science and technology, because science and technology impact nearly every aspect of modern life, right? Whether it's our food, communications, healthcare, education, you name it, we're influenced by our science and technology. It's driving the future. And it's also having a huge impact on faith communities and how they can live out their missions most effectively in the world. So we need to have this conversation. So I would like to ask you both something as we kind of get started in a group conversation here. There have been times when influential leaders in science have been vocally very hostile to religion. And likewise, there have been times when influential religious leaders have encouraged wariness regarding science to their constituents. And yet here are you both, and you both hold very influential positions in science and in religious leadership, respectively. And you're both here at this conversation today. So why, I'd like to ask you both, and you've already mentioned it a little bit, but why do you think this kind of conversation is important? This interaction between scientists and science leaders and religious communities and their influencers and thought leaders. Do you have any more to add to that? Who would you like, which one of you would like to go first?
Go ahead, Dr. Parikh.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Well, you know, the reason why I think it's a critical conversation for not just the United States, but for the world, is because the consequences of not having that conversation and that interpretation, as Dr. Anderson calls it, is immense. The consequence of these two very important facets of the lives of 330 million Americans and that not having that conversation, the consequences are gigantic. And we've seen it play out. We've seen it play out in the form of lives lost, in the form of my goodness, anger that turns to violence. And that consequence is too much for us to avoid a conversation that must be worth having. And that conversation requires respect. It requires starting from a place of understanding that these two aspects, science, religion, ethics, et cetera, are important to the practitioners. And so you can't start off a conversation by being disrespectful. when these are high priorities, they are meaningful, they are centers of our life. And so we must start with respect. But the reason why I think it's important is because the consequences of not having the conversation are dire.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson?
Well, I just piggyback off of that and say amen, and I agree. The consequences are dire, and the benefits are excellent. You know, when you can build relationships with people who are scientists and people of faith, and when they come together, brilliant things can happen and beneficial things can happen, not only in the lab, but on the streets and in the churches and in the communities. And so when they come together, there's a great benefit to the common good. And so the consequences are bad if we don't do it. The benefits are great if we do them.
Dr. Anderson, you had a story you told us as we prepped for this about this conversation that you've had that actually shows the benefit.
Yeah,
story.
It's pretty amazing.
It has to do with trust in science, and I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, can you tell us the story, Dr. Anderson? Do you know what we're talking about?
About a month or so ago, I was contacted from BioLogos, and they asked me if I would have a conversation with Dr. Francis Collins about vaccinations, who is the director of NIH, Dr. Fauci's boss, who reports to him. And I said, sure. So it would be Dr. Parikh and I, but we'd be talking about vaccinations. And the important reason for it was because there's so many people who were saying, they're not going to get vaccinated. And so we talked about the science of the vaccinations and the efficacy of and the safety and things of that sort. And so I decided that I would love to do that. Well, little did I know that the first lady of my state, Maryland, Governor Hogan's wife, would call and say, we want to do vaccinations in Howard County, Maryland, and we want Dr. Anderson to do it at his church. And I said to our people, if we can make it work, we'll make it work. And we did. And the National Guard came out, and you had these two shots, shot number one, and people would drive through to get their shots and that sort of thing, and then come back a couple of weeks later for a shot two. And so the governor and his wife and all of them come here. Okay, so all that's happening, right? In between then, I'm having this conversation with Dr. Collins. And so one church member got his shot, and I said, how you doing? And he said, great. I said, where's your wife? He goes, well, my wife is pregnant and she didn't want to get the shot. And I said, I said, do you mind if I ask Dr. Collins about that? And so sure enough, 2 days later, when the seminar happened with Dr. Collins, it was my first question out. I said, Dr. Collins, can you talk to me about the science of pregnant women getting the shot? And he went on and gave a great answer, basically saying it's safe, it could be really good for the kid, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so once he did that, it was amazing. She literally the very next week came and got her vaccination. Why? Because she trusted her pastor, and her pastor had a good relationship with the scientist that he trusted. So together, it made a family whole, because one was getting vaccinated, the other one wasn't. And the missing, the bridge that was out was conversation and interpretation. And then, of course, the trust. They already had the trust. They just didn't know who to trust, whose voice to trust. Do I trust the pastor's voice? Do I trust the scientist's voice? And so when they come together, then the person doesn't have to have a dichotomy in their mind of who to trust, because those two have collaborated. And now they know what the truth is. And so now they can go with that. Isn't that cool so far as a benefit?
I love it. It's such a great example of the benefit right in front of the concrete example.
I think it's also a great, because you had access to talk to Dr. Collins right there, and so you could ask him, and likewise I assume he could ask you for help if he was facing a question from his science community that you could speak to.
That's right.
But making those introductions and building that bridge, as you so adeptly call it, is something that we need to be doing more of. So we have those connections, we have those abilities to call on, the faith communities can call on scientists sometimes within their midst, or outside, and vice versa. I want to bring up a topic before we go to some more Q&A from our audience. And that is the topic of inclusion in science. There's a long overdue recognition starting to bubble up in the science community toward taking real concrete action toward increasing diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion in science. And, you know, for at the very least, this helps science be more as effective as it can be with all the talent that we want to come into the field. And yet demographic surveys show that people from demographics that are currently underrepresented in science also tend to identify strongly with faith as an important part of their lives and their personal identity and what shapes values. And often they feel that the atmosphere of science can be hostile to faith. And so how do we make science a more welcoming environment for people of faith, or where faith communities can feel like their children should go into science as a good way of living their lives that's in keeping with their values and faith? Do you have any thoughts on this? I'll start with you, Dr. Parikh, but either one of you.
Sure. Look, if we're going to address the challenges that we're going to face in this 21st century, if we're going to address Alzheimer's, address sickle cell anemia, address cancer, if we're going to fly rockets to the moon, if we're going to get to Mars, we're going to need the scientific and technical acumen from our entire population, right? We can't just draw from Palo Alto and Boston. As much as I love those two cities, we can't just draw from there. We got to draw from Appalachia. We got to draw from the Mississippi Delta. We got to draw from Hickory, North Carolina. And in doing so, we've got to make sure that there is there's safety in the sciences, and that it feels like a home for everyone, because we're going to need the descendants of pilgrims. We're going to need the descendants of Native Americans. We're going to need the descendants of enslaved peoples. We're going to need the descendants of Ellis Island arrivals. We're going to need them all if we're going to actually address these giant challenges. And so to make people feel that the sciences are for them, the first thing we have to do is have representation that can be seen, and it's out there, right? There are the scientist who is most directly responsible for the structure of this current vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, is a woman named Kizzmekia Corbett, African-American woman. When I look at the development of that vaccine, I see white Americans, Black Americans, immigrants. It is just remarkable. And so we've got to tell those stories so that people see that there's not just a home for them in these jobs, but that actually it's a path to success. It's a path to success that they see. So I think that's one way, but there are so many different paths. And I think that the first of those is just for people to see themselves in the journey.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson, anything to add? Yes.
I'd agree with that relationships, as you stated at the beginning, is really very important. And then respect, as was spoken, is really important. In other words, another way to look at relationships and respect is stop demonizing me, right? If you're a scientist and you're in the classroom, in the lab, or in a department somewhere, stop demonizing faith. Stop demonizing people of faith, right? If you are a pastor, if you are a spiritual leader, if you are an influencer with regard to people's spiritual development, stop demonizing the scientific community. Why? Because those are real people. And then the effect that your demonization has is they take a negative view of the scientists. Let's go from the faith side. They take a negative view of the scientists. They also take a negative view of science, and therefore they no longer have respect for science or the scientists. Okay, and it's the same on the other side. And what happens is we make each other look like buffoons. Why? We don't have relationship. We don't have respect. Now, if we have relationship, then it makes it harder for me to make wisecracks about scientists because I have relationships with Dr. Parikh. I have relationships with Dr. Wiseman. It's hard for me to laugh at jokes about white people because I have so many white people in my church and in my family. I had a church of over 52 different nations. And so when you have relationships with people, even when you have bad interactions with someone, like as a Black man, if I had bad interaction with a cop, which I did, I was 23 years old, got stopped 4 times in a 24-hour period in Chicago, blah, blah, blah. I can tell you that story or go read my book. But the bottom line is, because I have so many good relationships with police officers, I can't say they're all that way, right? Well, it's the same with science, and it's the same with religion. So if I were to give you a practical application, relationship is good, respect is good, but the opposite of that is demonization of people who are different. And when you do that, it takes away from relationship, it takes away from respect, and then kids are going to grow up feeling some kind of way about one side or the other.
Oh, I like that. And I like the fact that, you had a scientist in your own congregation who not only made himself known as a scientist to you, but invited you to his lab. Imagine him talking to your youth group or something about science. Right. And that would just change their lives, and vice versa. We have found out, I think particularly the research of Dr. Elaine Howard Eklund, that a lot of scientists don't realize there are people of faith all around them, including scientists of faith, because it's just not discussed a lot of times in scientific circles. And when they find out, there's a lot more open conversation about these other aspects of people's lives and how they come together and inform one another and enrich one another. So we have a comment from one of our audience members talking about shared experiences and how important it is that people use shared experiences as a mode of bridge building. And I couldn't agree more. You've kind of shared for some of that. And we do have a question. How would you persuade someone who actually demonizes people of faith to be open to potentially being more of a bridge builder? So any thoughts on, I guess I could go either direction. People who are tempted to kind of demonize people who are outside their own sphere of comfort. How do you turn them into either being bridge builders or at least being willing to walk over a bridge?
I know for me, I would recommend relationship building and exposure. When there is exposure, we are expanded. When we're not exposed, then we are closed, right? And when you are closed, you can't see anything around you. That's why I think like every kid, if they can, should travel, and every human being should travel the world. Because once you travel to the degree that you are able to afford it and be able to do it, the exposure then expands your mind beyond the small place where you might be closed. And it doesn't make you dumb or stupid. It makes you unexposed. And so, yes, when I'm demonizing those people because I'm not exposed to them. But if the person who's asking the question, if you have friends of faith who you respect and have relationship with, then bring them around those other people just simply to expose them in a social environment. And then when people begin to put faces with their philosophy, there usually creates a bit of dissonance within them if the people whose faces they have do not fit the stereotypes of their closed and small world.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have just about 1 minute left, but I think I might take 3. But I would like to know from both of you, if you have like a call to action. What do you think in your respective communities, particularly, or even across, what's your call to action? I mean, are we just gonna have this conversation today and then go on about our business? Or, are there some particularly pressing topics facing our world in the coming days and years where it would be really important for scientists and religious communities to have relationships and conversations and work together to face these challenges, and also to share a sense of wonder and awe in discovery. So any thoughts on this? We'll start with you, Dr. Parikh.
Yeah, my call to action is I'll talk to the scientific community, which is that it's not just about our program here at AAAS doing this. It's about scientists around the country doing this, right? So every community, we don't need one or two of me. We need 100,000 scientists who are willing to engage in your communities, engage with the houses of worship, engage with your PTA, engage with your county commission. This is you are a part of the community. You are not separate. Science it's a wonderful thing, and it's so awe-inspiring that you can live your life in it. I knew more about one molecule in the body for my graduate career than probably 99.9999% of the world, and you can get lost in it. But it turns out that molecule, it's a bunch of atoms. And when I raise my head up and I look out across the community, I realize that there is so much to be gained by reaching out and building a bridge, and not highlight an argument. You know, one of the things that we frequently do around the world is we say, the exciting thing is to pit one person against the other. It's a debate. It's not a debate. It's not a debate. It is about conversation, interpretation, as Dr. Anderson says, and that is not about a debate. That's not about being right or wrong. It is about finding ways to find shared experience, connection, and value so that we can move forward together. We may not always agree, but we respect one another enough to know that we're coming from a good place.
Thank you very much. Well said. Dr. Anderson?
Yeah, very well said. Thank you, Dr. Parikh. You know, there's an old African proverb that says, from afar, I thought he was a monster. When he got closer, I thought he was a human being. But when we were face to face, I realized he was my brother. When you're face to face, you can have conversation, and that will lead to this comprehension that I'm talking about. But when somebody's afar, they're demons, they are monsters, they are animals, those people are. In other words, one of the things that we can do is not just build relationships to the best of our ability and have respect, but we can reserve judgment when people are afar. In other words, if I'm not going to talk about that group if I don't have any relationships with them, I'm going to reserve my judgment about that particular incident until I get more information, just like scientists do. You're not supposed to make judgments. You're supposed to get the information first, then make a judgment or a conclusion or a kind of statement about it. We ought to do the same with people. And so to the religious community, I would say, do not make any judgments, but reserve judgment until you can get close enough to ask your scientific friends for more information before you make a declaration from the pulpit or in a life group or a small group or a Bible study or an article or a television interview or a radio interview. If you have not talked it through with a trusted friend who is a scientist, then it would be better not to make declarative statements. In that way, we won't demonize people as monsters or animals or, well, they're human beings. No, this is your brother. This is your sister. And I think that kind of mentality actually helps us build this bridge so we can be better interpreters, indeed better corpus callosums, if you will. So here's my action step, Dr. Wiseman. This summer, choose one or two people who you can actually have a relationship with over a cup of coffee or for dinner or something, where you say, I want to have a conversation with a scientist. If you're in a religious community, if you're in a scientific community, I want to have one cup of coffee or two with, a religious person. So that would be my practical call to action. This summer, do it.
Love it.
What a great idea. And in fact, we can start that right now because we're about to have a reception online. It's not exactly being together for a cup of coffee, but it's a first start. So, and I also appreciate what we've learned through DoSER program that, hey, you don't have to agree with everything this other group believes or practices in order to have a fruitful relationship and conversation. And I think that's very important for moving together forward together as we look toward the future. And we have a lot of interesting science topics that are affecting our future in even promising ways as we look toward improving our environment, working with better healthcare, better uses of knowledge and genetics and neuroscience, and even my favorite, space exploration. So we've got a lot to look forward to. And I'm glad that we're thinking about moving forward together. So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Parikh, for your inspiring comments today, your calls to action. And we want to thank all of our speakers and moderators today. We had so many interesting sessions on so many topics. And of course, these are just fertilizers to get us thinking much more deeply about all of these topics. So I want to thank you. And our audience that's joined us from all over the world, we want to thank you. We hope you will join us right now for our reception and social. All you have to do is click on that button next to it on the agenda at our conference website, which is DoSER.events in your URL. And we also hope you're going to take time to fill out our post-event survey. You can find a link for that survey at the bottom of the agenda on the website. We'd love to have your feedback. We also encourage you to continue this conversation on the forum. If you haven't noticed this yet, on the symposium website, which is doser.events, in your browser button, just put in doser.events, there's a forum button, and that forum is going to continue. And it's going to continue to be available for sharing resources and questions and insights from this symposium for the next month. And the recordings from today's event are going to be available on the website within a few days. So I'm going to share one last little slide here. There you go. I hope you can see that. This is how you can stay connected with DoSER. And you can see that we are also active both on our website and social media. And we also very much appreciate donations to the DoSER program. So please consider supporting what we do, and check out our websites as well, including our new resources website, sciencereligion.dialogue.org, and our main website, AAAS.org/DoSER. So I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I hope that we see you right now at the reception. Thank you very much for a wonderful day discussing how we can move forward at the intersection of science, religion, and ethics. Thank you very much from AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. Bye-bye.